Today we release our 2020-2021 first quarter actuals, along with the Government of Alberta's 2019 annual report. As I'm sure you'll appreciate, this has not been an ordinary year. Before I talk about the details of both the annual report and our Q1 update, I want to take us back to the summer of 2019. As a government, during last summer and last fall, we worked hard to deliver on a platform to improve our business environment, attract investment, and create jobs. At the same time, we built a four-year fiscal plan, which really culminated in our presentation of Budget 2019 in October. That was a four-year plan that included a modest spending reduction that resulted in a balanced budget in the year 22-23. And while 2019 was a relatively flat year in terms of economic growth, 2020 economic data was very positive and very promising. If we move to page 2 in the report, we'll find that year over year, economic activity for February was up 2%. Drilling rig activity was up 14% year over year. Oil production was up 6%. Exports were up a full 19%. And sales, retail sales, vehicle sales, and housing activity was all up year over year. In February, we presented Budget 2020, which was really a continuation of our Budget 2019 four-year fiscal plan. We also presented a Q3 update on the 2019 year, which in fact is the year ended March 31st, 2020. And our projections, our Q3 projections were very positive. In fact, we were projecting to come in with a lower deficit of $1.2 billion relative to budget. But then everything changed in March. Alberta encountered what I would characterize as a triple black swan event, which consisted of the pandemic-driven greatest global economic contraction since the Great Depression. It also included an unprecedented drop in energy prices. And of course, at the same time, we were called on to deal with COVID-19, a pandemic within our own borders. Our annual report, year-end March 31st, 2020 numbers will reflect that great challenge. And our Q1 report for the current fiscal year that we're in today will reflect that great economic challenge that, in fact, grew out of that triple black swan event. If we move to slide 3, our annual report, and again, this is for the year ended March 31st, 2020, we'll find that our deficit is, in fact, $12.2 billion. And the increase in the deficit is all attributable to a decline in revenue. One positive from our annual report, our March 31st, 2020 results, is that our total expenses have come in slightly lower than budget. If we move to slide 4, I want to draw our attention to the Q1 2020-2021 income statement. So this is a projection for the current fiscal year that we're in. For this current year, we're projecting a deficit of $24.2 billion. That's $16.8 billion higher than we budgeted. The vast majority of the reason for that increased budget deficit is a very, very significant decline in revenue. And it also comprised of a small increase in expenses as well. Revenues will be down $11.5 billion, or 23%. Personal income tax revenue will be down 15%. Corporate income tax revenue will be down approximately 53%. And non-renewable resource revenue will be down over 75%. Expenses will be up by $5.3 billion, largely due to COVID relief, extra funding for our healthcare system, and funding for Alberta's recovery plan. I want to draw you to slide number 5, our economic outlook. This is a graph that basically identifies some of the economic assumptions that we see going forward for the current fiscal year. Real GDP growth is forecast to contract 8.8%. Nominal GDP is expected to contract almost 14% in our current fiscal year. Employment is forecast to fall 7%, and the unemployment rate is expected to rise to an average of 11.6% this year. I'm going to move to slide 6. During this time of great economic and fiscal challenge, our focus going forward is twofold. We need to deliver the most cost-effective government services possible. That's absolutely essential. Alberta can no longer afford to be an outlier in terms of the cost of delivering services to Albertans. And secondly, we need to double down on our efforts to encourage economic growth in this province. And that's why we rolled out Alberta's Economic Recovery Plan in late June of this year. Alberta was the first province to roll out an economic recovery plan. And we believe economic recovery and growth is absolutely essential in dealing with our long-term fiscal challenge. Of course, our economic recovery plan really was threefold in nature. It included ensuring that we have the most competitive business environment possible. And to do that, we expedited our job creation tax cut, moving our corporate income tax rate from 10% to 8% effective July 1st. We'll also be doubling down on red tape reduction efforts, which are key to ensure that we have a very competitive business environment which attracts investments and provides for job creation in the future. Our economic recovery plan also includes strategic capital investments. We believe at a time like this, it's important that Alberta's government invest in key infrastructure projects that will improve our productivity, competitiveness, lead to increased investment attraction and job creation and economic growth. And in the meantime, provide employment opportunities for thousands of Albertans that need a job. The third part of our economic recovery plan is a focus on individual sector strategies. We know that the energy industry, the agriculture industry, and forestry industry continue to have a bright future in this province. But economic diversification is also incredibly important, and so we'll also be focusing on sectors such as tourism, tech, logistics, aerospace, and others. The McKinnon panel pointed out that Alberta was an outlier in terms of the cost to deliver government services to Albertans. And in Budget 2019, we started down the road of bringing down the cost of delivering services to Albertans and then holding those costs flat. We will be continuing to look for every opportunity to bring the cost of delivering services to Albertans down and in line with comparable provinces.
Are we going to see some major clashes or major changes in terms of the government stance negotiating with public sector unions in the province? What's your forecast on what the government's approach is going to be to existing contracts, new contracts coming up with public sector workers?
Sure. Well, we haven't finalized our labor mandate for the upcoming bargaining session. But the reality is this, that Alberta can no longer be an outlier in the cost of delivering services to Albertans. And so that will guide our decision-making around our labor mandate.
Yeah, g'day, Minister. You took us back in time, so I'm going to take you back in time to February over a couple of things that you said. You said back then that Alberta, we couldn't afford the luxury of diversification. Do you regret that now that oil has tanked so badly and clearly we should have been pursuing diversification much earlier? And further to Staples' question, you also said back then that, you will adjust budget, additional spending restraint will be required if economic conditions were impacting revenues. So what will the spending restraint look like?
Well, two things, and thanks for that, Emma. Firstly, I want to clarify those comments. My comments were taken out of context. The reality is diversification of the economy has always been important to our government. That's been the reality. I answered the question that day relative to the mix of government revenues And my answer was this: in terms of diversifying government revenues, the first thing we needed to do before we talked about taking a look at our tax structure, we needed to first ensure that we were delivering the most cost-effective services to Albertans. In other words, we needed to get our spending under control before we talked about government revenues. Economic diversification was important and remains important to Albertans, and it remains important to this government. In terms of further cost reductions, listen, we will be presenting a 3-year fiscal update in November, and again, a budget 2021 in February. We will be looking for every opportunity to ensure that we're delivering services most cost effectively.
Okay, my follow-up here is about crude by rail contract. What on earth is going on? Do you actually have any hope of offloading them, given the demand forecast for the next couple of years for crude does remain low, TMX is getting built, and also what is your government doing to protect Albertans in the Sturgeon refinery deal?
Sure. Well, there's a lot in that question. Firstly, in terms of crude by rail, we are making decisions to ensure that we're mitigating losses on behalf of Albertans in assigning crude by rail contracts. The reality is, with this energy crash and commodity price crash, crude by rail economics have changed drastically. And that has increased the costs for Alberta to assign those contracts onto the private sector. But I want to point this out. Had we continued operating crude by rail in this type of economic environment, it would have been an absolute economic disaster. So our assignment of these contracts and to the private sector will be significantly cheaper and more cost effective than had we gone forward with operating the crude by rail program. In terms of the Sturgeon refinery, we are taking a write-down in our year ended March 31st, 2020 on the Sturgeon refinery. That's a project that this government inherited from previous governments. And this write-down is a result of cost overruns, quite frankly, in years gone by in the cost of building the refinery, coupled with, again, changing economic conditions, particularly energy prices. That has resulted in a reduction in the net present value of future cash flows from the project and has resulted in a required write-down of the project. Right now, our government is looking at every option in front of us in order to ensure that we can minimize losses, maximize returns relative to the Sturgeon refinery.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my questions. Minister, I'm wondering, given all the news today, when and how are you now expecting to balance Alberta's budget?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And the reality is, balancing the budget will almost certainly need to be necessarily delayed. Now, balancing the budget is very important to Albertans, and it's very important and remains very important to this government. And so again, we will be presenting a fiscal update, 3-year fiscal update in November, and again, a budget in February of 2021. And that will give us time to work through the continued uncertainty. The reality is, right now, we are continuing to deal with an incredible amount of pandemic uncertainty and economic uncertainty. Right now, it would be almost impossible to provide a credible date to balance with the uncertainty that we're dealing with. Balancing does remain very important to our government, and we will be building a plan forward and presenting a date to balance to Albertans in the future. In the meantime, we will be governed by other fiscal anchors, such as net debt to GDP ratios, debt service cost to revenue ratios, and we'll be focusing on those issues and factors that we can manage, such as ensuring that we're delivering the most efficient and cost-effective government possible, and that we're doing everything we can do to encourage economic growth and economic recovery.
Okay, and as a follow-up, what does today's news do to the plans to study the feasibility of an Alberta pension plan and an Alberta provincial police force?
So relative to the Alberta pension plan, the great fiscal challenge and economic challenge that is facing Albertans, I believe, really compels us to take a look at every opportunity to provide economic relief to Albertans. And that's why taking a look at an Alberta pension plan makes a lot of sense. We will be doing a deep dive into that issue to understand the benefits, the risks, potential costs, and economic rewards of a potential Alberta pension plan. Now, rest assured, the Premier has made it very clear that before a final decision would be made, we would take that decision to Albertans. But again, at a time like this, I believe it's absolutely critical that we look at every opportunity to improve the economic fortunes of Albertans. Relative to an Alberta police force, I'll just follow up on your second part of the question. Again, we think it's critically important to take a look at the ramifications of a provincial police force. That was one of the recommendations of the Fair Deal panel. Obviously, one of the considerations is the cost of a Alberta police force. But again, that's a recommendation that we accepted from the panel, and we're moving forward on that analysis, and I'm looking forward to the results.
Thank you very much. Minister, the Premier's talked a lot about a fiscal reckoning coming. So what does that look like? Based on the numbers we're seeing today, the updated numbers, what does that fiscal reckoning look like?
Well, listen, it looks like a province, a government that delivers government services most efficiently, that a government that is no longer an outlier in terms of the cost of delivering services to its residents. And so again, we will be presenting a 3-year fiscal update in November and a reset budget in February 2021.
Okay, just to follow up, sorry, does this mean we'll be looking more at cuts? This has been sort of danced around this morning. You've been asked about this. I'm going to be a lot more direct. Will we be seeing a lot more government cuts this year into next year? Because, the pandemic is not going to go away, it looks like.
Listen, stay tuned for Budget 2021. Again, we believe at a time like this, it's absolutely essential that Alberta delivers the most efficient services possible. And again, the McKinnon panel pointed out that Alberta is an outlier, and we can no longer afford to be an outlier. So we will continue really down the path that we identified in Budget 2019 and Budget 2020 of moving this province to ensure that we're delivering very efficient government services. That will continue to be the theme. We will look at every opportunity in delivering.
Minister, you're forecasting almost $100 billion in debt by the end of this fiscal year. Could you tell me what your calculation of the total interest payments on that debt will be?
Right now, we are projecting that interest payments, debt service costs, of course, will go up, but they will only go up marginally this upcoming year. And the reason for that is that, in fact, interest rates have been falling. Debt service costs have been falling. And so that's been one positive in this whole time of economic uncertainty. In fact, debt that has been renewing in this province is being renewed at considerably lower rates. And so that will keep a lid, at least in the short term, on our debt service costs.
Hi, thanks for taking my question, Minister. You keep talking about how you need to be the most efficient government at delivering services, cost-effective, and that we'll have an idea of what's to come in November. Could you give us perhaps just one example of something where you are looking at becoming more efficient? Just one example.
Well, listen, the question was posed earlier around the cost of our public sector. The cost of Alberta's public sector has been high relative to other jurisdictions. Again, we can no longer afford to be an outlier. So that's one example. But, delivering cost-effective services, efficient government services is critically important. But the other part that's also vitally important is ensuring that we grow our economy. We will not meet this great fiscal challenge without significant economic growth in the province. And again, that's why we've really doubled down on expeditiously rolling out an Alberta economic recovery plan.
And alongside that, on the other side of the ledger, are you looking at revenues at all, a healthcare premium, new user fees, a sales tax, anything like that on the table?
Well, listen, at a time like this, at a time of great economic challenge for so many Albertans and Alberta businesses to look at raising costs for those businesses and for Albertans, I believe would be irresponsible. That is a greater, bigger question that we as Albertans will have to grapple with. But in the intermediate, in the short and intermediate time frame, we need to focus on ensuring that we're delivering government services most cost effectively, that we're doing everything we can to grow the economy. And in the longer term time frame, it will be important that Albertans have a discussion, that we collectively have a discussion on revenue use structure, tax structure, and again, we actually committed to that in our platform, and I would expect that we will initiate that process later in our mandate.
Hi there, good morning. I'm just wondering where negotiations with Ottawa on some kind of fiscal stabilization fund, lifting of the cap and retroactive rebate is at, whether Ottawa has talked to Alberta government officials about that issue during the pandemic, and whether any conditions have been attached to Ottawa even considering that, such as a provincial sales tax or some kind of climate initiative. Thank you.
Sure. Well, that's a great question, Kelly. In terms of fiscal stabilization changes, as you know, we advocated for a fundamental change in the fiscal stabilization program. Of course, the fiscal stabilization program has a cap of $60 per person. That was a cap that was basically established back in the 80s and has really limited the effectiveness of that program when provinces experience a significant reduction in revenue. And so, of course, we advocated for the rationale and defensible rationale to lift that cap. We had support, effectively have support from all provinces on that issue. It was an issue that I believe we had front and center with the federal government. And when COVID hit, quite frankly, that would appear that it's been put on the back burner. I've consistently raised it with Minister Morneau, and I've already raised it with Minister Freeland. It remains to be an important issue for Alberta. Ultimately, we need a change. We need a correction in the calculation methodology of fiscal stabilization. On the other part of your question, there has never been talk of tying other deliverables to changes in fiscal stabilization. Listen, we need to see that program improved so it can function as I believe it was intended, and there should not be any other add-ons or qualifications or considerations relative to that change.
You speak about Alberta not being able to can no longer afford to be an outlier on its expenses. In your view, how much longer can Alberta afford to be an outlier on revenue? I mean, as you said, this deficit change has been almost entirely based on revenue, and we are the grand outlier in terms of reliance on non-renewable resource revenues, on corporate tax rate, if you just made, on provincial sales tax, and another front. How much longer can Alberta keep this outlier status?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. Our challenging economic results are largely, almost entirely actually, from a reduction in revenue. And that reduction in revenue has come from reduction in economic activity, a reduction in global energy prices. And so that's why we're putting an inordinate focus on economic recovery and economic growth in this province. Again, in terms of the discussion around revenue structure, income tax structure, that will be an important discussion for Albertans in the future. At this point in time, while we are facing, in fact, in the midst of this great economic challenge, this is not a time to talk about raising taxes. This is a time to deliver government services most efficiently. This is a time to ensure that we're doing everything we can to grow this economy.
Is this time of economic uncertainty and recovery the time to make dramatic changes to our services, or does that risk hampering economic recovery as well?
Well, listen, if we're delivering government services most efficiently, that provides resources for other things. Firstly, it will ultimately reduce our deficit. But it can also ensure that we are able to invest in key strategic infrastructure projects, which will ultimately position Alberta for an economic recovery and for further economic growth, at the same time create job opportunities for Albertans. So it's absolutely incumbent that we deliver operations most efficiently.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what Jason and Carrie were asking about the revenue side of things. I've talked to economists who say that tax cuts can work in sight, have businesses come to a jurisdiction, but it's usually a long-term strategy. And it sounds to me like you're really banking on having businesses come here and, that extra revenue that you'll get from additional taxation. But we're hearing this is a long-term strategy. So, again, I have to ask, what are you going to do in the short term to increase revenue? You can't do it all alone, Minister, by cutting services.
We are going to do everything to encourage economic growth and economic recovery in this province. And certainly our job creation tax cut is a component of that, but it's not the entire story. It also includes modernizing our regulatory environment, reducing red tape. Right now we believe we have an opportunity to be ambitious in removing red tape, which again impedes business investment in this province and jobs and economic growth. We will also focus on specific sector strategies, work with industry experts to determine what we can do to position this province for specific sectors, again, to be most competitive, to attract investment and grow the economy. So while our job creation tax cut is an important part of our economic recovery strategy, our strategy involves several other facets. And again, long-term, absolutely, it's going to be important that Albertans have the discussion around revenue structure, tax structure. That's an important discussion. But today, right now, we need to focus on delivering efficient government and growing the economy.
But as a follow-up, Minister, there's only so much you can cut before the government is not functional. So what are you going to do in the short and medium term to increase revenue on the revenue side of things?
Our revenue reductions that we're facing right now are a result of a collapse in economic activity in this province. Again, our job number one right now is to encourage economic recovery and economic growth. And so that will result in increased government revenues. And that's absolutely essential to deal with our great fiscal challenge.
Sorry for interrupting you earlier. Thank you for taking my question. I was just wondering why the forecast doesn't factor in the possibility of a second wave and the impact a second wave of COVID-19 could have on the finances of the province.
Well, listen, this economic forecast, I believe, does recognize the uncertainty that exists both with the pandemic in the province as well as the economic uncertainty. Those are the realities that we're working in right now. And so, again, we've committed early on, and we continue to commit, that we will ensure that Alberta's healthcare system has the resources needed to deal with the pandemic and any challenges that arise from that pandemic.
But why not, factor in the possibility of another shutdown?
Well, listen, we as a province have been very successful relative to many jurisdictions around the world in dealing with COVID. And I would suggest this, the real success, the reason for our great success dealing with COVID is that Albertans have a great sense of self-responsibility. Albertans have been making responsible decisions, and we've managed to bend the curve down, and we're keeping our curve at, right now, I would suggest, manageable levels. We can't predict that there won't be a second wave, but I believe that ultimately that Albertans will continue to be self-responsible. And again, there will be bumps along the way, no doubt. But in terms of shutting down our economy, we will be very reluctant to do that.
Well, hi, Minister. Thanks for taking my call. Just on the whole issue of the net fiscal contribution of Alberta and also our gross fiscal contribution to the rest of Canada, I'm just wondering if you can state whether or not that's expected to decline and by how much. So the growth and then the net.
Sure. Well, Alberta has been a great contributor to the nation fiscally, and you know, as you know, even over the last 5 years, we've made net fiscal contributions of close to $20 billion to the nation. And here's the reality. I believe that I'm optimistic that our economy will recover. In fact, I'm confident that our economy will recover, that we will continue to be a contributor to the nation fiscally. Now, we need to see some changes in our fiscal transfer programs. I've talked a little bit about changes we need in the Fiscal Stabilization program. That's essential to ensure that Alberta gets a fair deal in Confederation. We also need some changes in the equalization program. Right now, the equalization program has some flaws in its calculation methodology. We need some changes and some fixes in equalization as well. But in terms of Alberta continuing to be a wealth creation engine of the nation, right now we are going through some economic hard times. But again, because of the great entrepreneurial character and spirit of Albertans, because of the great sense of self-responsibility that Albertans have, and the fact that we're risk takers, the fact that we get out, we work hard and invest, and again, take responsibility for our decisions, I am confident that we will emerge again as the wealth creation engine of the country.